Welcome to our online video series, Reading Hope in Trying Times. Our guest today is our good friend, Kate Rademacher. Kate grew up outside of Boston and now lives in Chapel Hill, North Carolina with her family. In her debut memoir, Following the Red Bird, First Steps into a Faith of Life, Kate describes how she came to embrace a relationship with God after maintaining a pick and choose approach to spirituality for many years. Raised in a staunchly secular community, Christianity was never a path she had seriously considered. Married to a devout Buddhist, Kate was sitting on a cushion at her husband's meditation center one day when Jesus appeared unexpectedly in her consciousness and called her to follow him. She was baptized a year later to that day. A graduate of Wesleyan University in Connecticut and the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill's Gillings School of Global Public Health, Kate's professional work is focused on international public health. Certainly a very relevant topic for today. Kate's second book, Their Faces Shown, A Foster Parent's Lessons on Loving and Letting Go, will be released in the summer of 2020. Kate's also working on her third book, Reclaiming Rest, The Promise of Sabbath, Solitude, and Stillness in a Nonstop World, which will be published by Broadleaf Books, an imprint of 1517 Media, in 2021. Kate was also going to be involved in our Charlotte conference that was to be going on this week. But when it's rescheduled, she'll certainly be involved then, I'm sure. So in any event, I'm really glad to have Kate with us here today.
Thank you, Brian. This is really fun to be doing this when we're all, working from home or otherwise quarantined and isolated. So thanks for having me during the conversation.
Well, it's always fun to do things with you anyway, Kate. So I'm glad that we're getting a chance to do this.
Thank you, Brian.
Perhaps you can start by sharing some of your thoughts on this health crisis.
Yeah, I think for so many of us, our heads are just spinning. We, even those of us, like, as you mentioned, I work in global public health, and we were all to a certain degree taken by surprise and are, still thinking about the implications of it. I think what, as a public health person, what's troubling me is all of the populations that are vulnerable and at risk around the world. And, that includes, I work a lot in sub-Saharan Africa, in India. It's really scary. People that are already vulnerable, this just compounds that exponentially. So that's really hard. And obviously in the U.S., the emotional, economic, and health toll is large already and is going to probably get bigger. So, this is really, I work with someone at Duke University who, his name is John O'Quick, and he's written a book about epidemics and just, how I talked to him the other day and he said this is sort of an event of a lifetime. So, on that hand, I think we're all just sobered and worried. And for those of us who are in a relatively privileged position, like myself, to be able to work from home, to, have health insurance, to have some savings in the bank, I think I've never been so aware of my privilege as I have been in the past 2 weeks. And I read online last night on Twitter, it's like someone said the same thing, and he said what we do with our privilege in these coming weeks and months is going to, really determine the path forward for our society. So that's kind of on the hard side and the challenging side. I think there's also been this kind of incredible, still unfolding, perhaps silver lining of all of this, which is that my third book, which I'm working on in real time, is about Sabbath and rest and sort of the frantic lifestyle that so many of us maintain on a regular basis. And is this a collective call to slow down? Is this an invitation? I don't know if you've seen it. I've seen a lot of poems going around online, et cetera, just saying that this is a moment. This is a moment to perhaps return to something more sacred, more holy, more slow, more connected. So I think it's a juxtaposition. There's all this fear and anxiety, and there's also, I think, for many of us, this kind of opening or question of whether we could be slowing down in ways that could actually benefit us and benefit the planet over the long term. So just a few of my thoughts.
So if you don't mind going down a little bit of a tangent, I'm kind of curious about your thoughts on Africa. I don't think that's been terribly highly infected yet, has it?
No, it hasn't yet, but I think that's the next horizon. And the fear is that health systems are already incredibly weak. And, there was, West Africa did, quite a remarkable job at responding to the Ebola crisis, but this situation is, going to have unique and different challenges. And I was on the phone this morning with colleagues and yesterday with colleagues in Nigeria and Kenya, and everything is shutting down there too. They're all starting to work from home. In-person health trainings are trying to be done remotely. We're trying to develop what we're calling no-touch clinical guidelines. I'm not a clinician and I'm not an expert in this, but I think even just I also work some in India, and the fact that that they've gone on, that they've shut down, they've telling people to stay home is so difficult. I mean, in India, where there's such enormous, huge poverty, and to have people who don't have stable housing, who are living perhaps in urban slums, et cetera. I mean, who are so already on the edge of extreme poverty. This is just really, really huge. So.
Well, when this whole thing started taking off, that was like one of the first things I thought of too. Is that some of those areas that you've mentioned, were really have a difficult time coping with this. Yeah. But, so far it's been more, I think this is more just because of where international travel is predominant. It's affected other areas first. Right. But, I still can't believe that it's not going to hit some of those other areas really hard, right, even with the preventions that they're, already taking.
And I think there are impacts that we don't think about immediately. And that's even been really eye-opening for me. We think about coronavirus and what that will do to people, but what we may not think about is how it will affect the health system overall. For example, I work in reproductive health, so I work on primarily contraception. If supply chains are affected from China, that affect both commodities that are being shipped from China, but also the drugs that are in China. In the drugs that are in those products. If anything in the supply chain breaks down, then women, and men and children are less likely to be able to get the health products, the health commodities they need. So, or if health resources are diverted to deal with a crisis, again, I was just reading this really sobering article about the gender impact of Ebola was huge, because women were more likely to die from obstetric emergencies, during the Ebola crisis, because they weren't getting the maternal and healthcare that they needed. So I think, again, I know we weren't going to go down this, so
no, I'm sorry to,
but, and I'm not, this is not my area of expertise. I don't work on epidemics or public health emergencies. I work on reproductive health in normal times, but certainly I am concerned, as are many of my colleagues.
Well, I certainly didn't mean to put you on the spot, but I just knew that your expertise about this would be so far beyond mine that I was just curious to hear what your thoughts were.
Yeah, it's really, we see this in the U.S., but when health systems are weak, it's really scary, and that's the reality in many low-income countries.
So next, maybe you can talk a little bit about, different spiritual practices, different ways that God has helped you over time.
Yeah, so maybe I can just back up a minute and say I never expected to be sitting across from you, Brian, or in any of this realm, because as you just gathered, I was happily and busily working along in my public health career as a non-Christian, and as someone who was raised, actually, you read my blurb, that I was raised in a pretty secular environment. And also, frankly, for a lot of people, Christianity was, it was not something I considered seriously, because a lot of people I grew up in, a lot of people I grew up with sort of felt like Christianity was almost a dirty word. Like, it wasn't associated with progressive politics, with social justice. And of course, now that I am a Christian and have been called into this life, I understand that very differently. I know the huge, deep, legacy of social justice and Christianity much better. But just in the community that I grew up in, it was, again, staunchly secular. So I never considered a Christian path. It was never something that was on my radar, but I was always spiritual and explore different spiritual practices. And in my early 30s, very surprisingly, became more exposed to Christian teachings, and then, as you read in my brief blurb, unexpectedly was called to Christ and was baptized when I was in my early 30s. So then, even more surprising, because again, none of this was planned or on the agenda, I felt this restless, undeniable urge to write about the journey. And so I bought half a case of books to bring to Writing for Your Life. So I have
a good supply now.
I have 30 of them waiting with nowhere to go. So I'll hold
I know
up
the feeling. I bought a whole bunch of journals, to give away at the conference, and they're just sitting here in my office.
So yeah, the image for my book, Falling Red Bird, was actually comes from The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. And so I don't know if you know that image, but when Lucy's walking in the woods, there's a red bird that jumps from branch to branch.
Oh, of course, yes.
Yeah, and so she turns back and she says, so this quote from that becomes the epigraph, is in the epigraph of my book, and then becomes the title of the image in the title of the book. And she looks at the red bird who's hopping from branch to branch, and she says, "I do believe he means us to follow him." And so that's the title of my book is Falling Red Bird. And so that became, and I was telling a friend about my spiritual journey, and he said, "Oh, it reminds me of Lucy and the red bird." And so, one thing I've been thinking about during this time of crisis is, again, how do we listen for God's voice? How do we get quiet enough, even in these crazy times and even in these chaotic times when so many of us are anxious and there's so much uncertainty? How can we still ourselves enough to discern and respond to where God is calling us? I'm researching a lot of book about Sabbath, so I've been reading this book, Subversive Sabbath, which is so great. I can't recommend it enough. And he just talks about how we get so compulsive, including, this was way before COVID, that we check the news 200 times a day. We check social media compulsively. We tweet something before we even have to think about it. And that Sabbath and stillness helps separate that, break down that compulsivity, so that we can again get back into the discipline of discernment. I didn't even think about it, but I have on my wall, this is my favorite. So it's Dana Trent, who we both know, also uses this in her book, but it's "Be still and know that I am God," and then it goes down each line: "Be still and know that I am, be still and know, be still, be." It's like taking the psalm and turning it into a prayer. So I think that's a sort of invitation that this crisis has, perhaps for me and perhaps for others, been a surprising gift. Is, can we use the time of the collective slowing down to also slow down our hearts and to really discern where God may be calling us to serve our neighbor and, to reconnect with God during this time?
I totally agree, and I'm going to put you on the spot again and ask you if you might be interested in writing a blog article that we can put up on the Compassionate Christianity and Writing for Your Life websites, because what you're talking about is incredibly timely, and I think the insights that you would bring would be valuable.
Well, it's really been, this may be a bit of a tangent on my side, but my book manuscript that I'm writing for Broadleaf is due in July to my editor. And so I was just writing her yesterday. She's great, Valerie, you may know her, and about how to pivot the content pivot the content I had planned to weave in the COVID experience into my reflections on rest and Sabbath, knowing that the book won't be published till 2021. And already it's been incredibly helpful for me to process what's going on, to be writing about that in real time and to be integrating it, knowing also that some of the lessons I think about the dance of acceleration and deceleration in our lives will presumably be, true, that sort of, I was talking to somebody and said, at some point we're going to speed up again, and I think some of these reflections about what do we need to remember about slowing down and becoming still and being with God, hopefully will be timeless, even though we're so also compelled with the crisis of the moment.
I think there's going to be some really interesting sociology studies, that come to analyze what all the changes are. What are all the long-lasting changes that have come because of this experience for our society?
Well, and on that note, to prepare for this little webinar, I brought out some of my books that I'm reading while I'm COVID lockdown, and one of them was a Sabbath book. This is another good one, which will make you laugh. Good Christian Sex. And I've
heard people recommend that. I thought, what are you talking? What?
It's
explain
well,
it to me.
I'll explain. So two things. What you said about the sociological moment made me think of that, because they talk about like the baby boomers, the moments when or people after in a hurricane there are going to be all these babies being born. So we're wondering if there's going to be all these COVID babies being born, because we're all trapped in the house, and people, what's there to do and what's free and what's easy. So we'll see if in 9 to 12 months there's a lot of COVID babies being born. But on a more, I think that's a real thing, but on a more serious note, perhaps, as again, part of my Sabbath book, there's been all this research to show that so I work in reproductive health, and so sexuality and health are of interest to me. But there's also this interesting research that has shown that Americans are having less sex. And so I'm writing about that partly as an exploration of Sabbath, and again, is slowing down a way that humans can reconnect to themselves. But zooming out one step further, as a new Christian, or a relatively new Christian, it's been 8 years now, so I'm not sure if I count as new, and as someone who works in public health and reproductive health, there's so little good theology out there, I found, or it's hard to find sometimes, around positive messages around what Christianity has to say about sexuality. That's why I really like this book. It's very, I don't know about you, Brian, but when you think of negative things about Christianity, this is something maybe we can explore also through Compassionate Christianity. I think if you just read the newspaper, you think that Christians are obsessed with sexuality, in terms of who can marry whom and who can love whom and whether we can use birth control or not. And, that's what, if you just read the newspaper, you would think that Christianity is. But I don't know about you, we rarely talk about sexuality at church, at my church. It's not the obsession. And so what does Christianity have to say about sexuality that's more than just what you can and can't do? Our gifts are, our bodies are a gift from God. So what, and we need to keep our young people safe who are dealing with difficult choices. So anyway, while you're stuck in the house, good Christian sex.
Okay, well, thank you for explaining that to me and sharing the value, unexpected value, I guess I should say. many faceted. So maybe, at least one benefit I hope of, not having to be at the conference this week is that you'll be able to get some additional writing done.
Well, you would think so, except I think like many people, it's remarkably hard to juggle everything at home. You would think that suddenly there'd be more time, but I have a daughter at home and I've got a full-time day job, and I think time management is in some ways, I was thinking about it this morning, like having the discipline of getting up, getting my daughter out to school, driving to work. I'm saving an hour and a half a day on my commute. So that's amazing. But yet there's also this kind of mind muffliness, the squishiness. I don't know if other people are experiencing that, but
the hour and a half disappears, huh?
Or it's, it's just, I think also, this has only been in the past 2 weeks. I think we're all stunned. It's just hard to sort of focus. And like I said, to be integrating what's happening in real time into my writing has certainly been a challenge the past 2 weeks. But writing is therapeutic, and I have the past 2 days gotten back to writing, and it's been really wonderful. So for those of
lots of sociology studies are coming.
Yeah.
So Kate, one of the other things that you've written about are foster children and foster families. Maybe you can talk a little bit about what that, environment means in this kind of an environment.
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. So as you mentioned, again, in my bio blurb, I have a second memoir coming out this summer, which is being published by Light Messages Publishing, and the title is Their Faces Shown, and it's about our experience as foster parents. And I'm in no way a foster care expert, but we did have a foster daughter who we love deeply, who's no longer living with us, and so it's a story of, it's about that journey. So yeah, I mean, I'm thinking about foster families and adoptive families. That's, of course, those families are also being affected by coronavirus. I'm in a few foster parent and adoptive parent groups on Facebook, and it's amazing any day to read about people's stories and experiences, but to be reading about people who were scheduled to adopt in the past 2 weeks, and either it got delayed or they just got in under the wire before the courts closed. I mean, it kind of gives you chills. A family that just took in 3 boys as foster parents, and then, I mean, you can't make this up, but the boy who had been with them for 7 days got appendicitis, had to be in hospital, and because they're in lockdown, the foster father went with him. Anyway, so these just really, I mean, people are living their lives during this, including acts of incredible service. And, I'm also on the board of an organization called National Crittenton, and one of the populations we work on is girls who are in the juvenile justice system. And another group I'm just really concerned about during coronavirus is incarcerated populations. I'm, again, just jumping around here, but I'm pen pals with a man who's in prison, and he's over 60, and the data tells us that he's vulnerable for sure. And then you think of teen girls who are in the juvenile justice system. So I think as we think about coronavirus, we also need to be thinking about these vulnerable populations, families who are at risk of abuse and neglect, whose kids may be at risk of being in foster care. And my my local social service department is halfway closed down because of coronavirus. What's happening to those? I don't know. So anyway, my heart I, like many of us, kind of goes in a lot of different directions, and I think this emergency is helping us think about loving our neighbor as ourselves, perhaps even in new ways. I'm sorry, the light. I'm in a sunny room and the light's going down, so I'm going to move this up.
It's not a problem.
So anyway, yeah, but I think that's, I think for me, I'm not sure about others, I'm thinking about vulnerable populations in new ways with the coronavirus. In some ways, again, this emergency makes me incredibly aware of my privilege, but it also makes me more tuned in to people who perhaps are at the margin. And so hopefully, again, that can be a long-term benefit of the crisis, that we all become more connected to our neighbor in new ways, and love one another and support one another, and rethink some of our broader, economic and, we were just talking about the criminal justice system, all of these systems that affect us sort of in new and perhaps bigger ways as a result of this crisis. I can hopefully hope that we do that, including as Christians.
Well, I think that it will, and I pray that it will. So Kate, thank you so much for spending some time with us and sharing your knowledge and your experience and your insight into several different areas. It's greatly appreciated by me, and I know it will be by others.
Well, thank you so much, Brian. This has been really fun, and it's been fun. I have a blog that I wrote recently, actually, after our Wild Goose experience, called What It Means to Be Bivocational, and I don't have a lot of opportunities to talk about both my vocations, my public health vocation and my writing vocation, so this has really been a gift. And just in general, I'll give a shout out before we end to what a wonderful community Writing for Your Life has been for me, what a help you've been to me, and also just the broader community. So it's fun to connect to the broader Writing for Your Life virtual community out there in this way, and hope we can keep, even in these social distancing times, we can stay connected. So appreciate you facilitating that.
Well, that value goes both ways, Kate. There's no question about that. So thank you for all you've done to help make Writing for Your Life a great community. And yes, there'll be plenty of more opportunities to come. No question about that.
Great.
All right. Well, take care and
Thanks.
stay healthy, and we'll see you again.
All right. Take care. Thanks again.